The clock struck 7 in the morning as David Wellington adjusted his silk tie in the mirror of his enormous bedroom. At 45, he had everything a man could want. His mansion sat on 5 acres in the most expensive part of town, with marble, floors that sparkled under crystal chandeliers, and windows so tall they seemed to touch the sky. But if you asked David, he'd tell you he earned every penny through hard work and smart thinking. David wasn't born rich. He grew up in foster homes, moving from place to place until he aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a worn backpack and fierce determination. He started by cleaning office buildings at night and studying business books during the day. 27 years later, he owned half the commercial real estate in the city. Everyone knew his name, and most people feared it too. Running a mansion this size wasn't easy. David needed a full staff to keep everything perfect, exactly the way he liked it. The gardeners had to trim every bush to the same height. The pool cleaner couldn't leave even one leaf floating on the water. And his housekeeper had to make sure every surface gleamed like new every single day. Mrs. Peterson had been his head housekeeper for 8 years. She knew exactly how David wanted his. Coffee, black, steaming hot, served in the blue china cup, never the white one. She knew to iron his newspapers so they lay flat, and she never, ever moved anything on his desk without asking first. But last week, Mrs. Peterson announced she was retiring to live with her daughter in Florida. "You can't just leave," David had said, his voice sharp with irritation. "I have important meetings all week. How am I supposed to manage without proper help?" Mrs. Peterson had smiled sadly. "Sir, I've trained my replacement well. The agency will send someone good." Now David stood in his kitchen, watching a woman he'd never seen before arrange his breakfast on the counter. She was older, maybe in her late 60s, with kind eyes and gentle movements. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore the standard black uniform all his housekeepers used. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," she said softly, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "I'm Dorothy. The agency sent me to take Mrs. Peterson's place. Your coffee is ready just how you like it." David picked up the cup and took a sip. It was too weak. "This isn't right," he said, setting it down harder than necessary. "Mrs. Peterson knew how to make proper coffee. This tastes like water." Dorothy's face remained calm, though David noticed a small flicker in her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll make it stronger next time. It might take me a day or two to learn your preferences." "I don't have a day or two," David snapped, checking his expensive watch. "I have a board meeting in an hour, and I need everything to be perfect. Do you understand what perfect means?" "Yes, sir. I'll do my best." David grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. "Make sure the house is spotless when I return, and next time have my coffee ready at exactly 7, not 7:05. Dorothy watched him leave through the kitchen window, her heart heavy. She'd worked in many homes over the past 40 years, cleaning and cooking for families who treated her like furniture. Some were kind, some were distant, but this man seemed different. There was an anger in him that ran deeper than impatience about coffee. The truth was, Dorothy needed this job desperately. Her sister Rose was sick with diabetes, and the medical bills kept piling up. Dorothy's Social Security check barely covered rent for their tiny apartment, let alone medicine and doctor visits. When the agency offered her this position, even though the pay was low, she couldn't say no. She spent the morning learning the layout of the huge house. Every room was decorated like a magazine photo. Expensive furniture that no one ever sat on, artwork that cost more than most people made in a year, and not a single personal touch that showed who David really was as a person. In his study, Dorothy found walls lined with business awards and newspaper clippings about David's success. Photos showed him shaking hands with mayors and governors, cutting ribbons at building openings, standing behind podiums giving speeches. But there wasn't a single picture of family or friends. No wedding photos, no children's school pictures, nothing that suggested David had people who loved him. As she dusted the massive wooden desk, Dorothy noticed something that made her pause. There was one small photo frame, face down, as if David had looked at it once and couldn't bear to see it again. She didn't dare turn it over, but she wondered what image was so painful that a successful man like David had to hide it. When David returned that evening, he immediately began his inspection. He ran his finger along the dining room table, checking for dust. He examined the way Dorothy had arranged his mail. He opened the refrigerator to make sure everything was organized properly. "The bathroom mirrors have water spots," he announced, his voice cold and critical. "And you moved my business cards on the desk. I specifically told Mrs. Peterson never to disturb my workspace." Dorothy stood quietly, hands folded in front of her. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington. I was only dusting around them. I put everything back exactly where it was." "Exactly where it was?" David's voice rose. "These cards were stacked perfectly straight. Now they're crooked. Do you think I don't notice details? Do you think I got where I am by accepting sloppy work?" Something in David's angry tone stirred a memory in Dorothy's mind. Something familiar about the way he tilted his head when he was upset, the way his jaw tightened when he was trying to control his temper. She'd seen those expressions before, long ago, but she couldn't quite place where. "I'll be more careful tomorrow," Dorothy said quietly. "Tomorrow you'll do better, or there won't be a day after tomorrow. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." That night, after David had eaten his dinner in silence and gone to his room, Dorothy sat in the small quarters Mrs. Peterson had shown her, a tiny bedroom and bathroom in the basement where the help was expected to stay. She pulled out her phone and called her sister. "How was your first day?" Rose asked, her voice weak but concerned. "It was fine," Dorothy lied. She didn't want Rose to worry. "The house is beautiful, and the work isn't too hard. Is he nice to you?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "He's just particular about things. Some people are like that when they have a lot of responsibility." But as she hung up the phone, Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that David's anger came from somewhere deeper than perfectionism. She'd raised children before, helped raise her sister's kids when Rose was working double shifts. She recognized the signs of someone who'd learned early in life that they couldn't depend on anyone, someone who'd built walls so high they couldn't see over them anymore. There was something else, too, something about David that nagged at the back of Dorothy's mind. The way he moved, certain gestures he made without thinking. They reminded her of someone, but the memory was buried so deep she couldn't reach it. As she lay in the narrow bed that night, listening to the sounds of the big empty house settling, around her, Dorothy said a quiet prayer. She prayed for patience with her difficult new employer, for strength to keep this job that she needed so badly, and for her sister's health to improve. She had no way of knowing that upstairs, David was, lying awake too, staring at the ceiling of his master bedroom. Despite all his success and all his money, sleep didn't come easily. It never had. Not since he was a little boy in foster care, never knowing if tomorrow would bring a new home or another goodbye. Neither of them realized that their lives were about to change forever, or that the answers to questions they'd both carried for decades were sleeping just floors apart. 3 weeks had passed since Dorothy started working at David's mansion, and each day felt like walking on thin ice. No matter how hard she tried, nothing she did seemed good enough for him. If she made his coffee strong, he complained it was bitter. If she made it lighter, he said it was too weak, too. When she cleaned his study in the morning, he wanted it done in the evening. When she switched to evenings, he demanded it be finished before he came downstairs. Dorothy had worked for demanding people before, but David was different. His criticism wasn't just about the work. It felt personal, like he was testing her, pushing to see how much she could take before she broke. "The towels in the guest bathroom are folded wrong," he'd announced the night before, his voice sharp with irritation. "They look sloppy. Mrs. Peterson never left towels looking like that." Dorothy had refolded them 3 times until they met, his standards, her arthritic hands aching from the precise movements he demanded. She never complained, never talked back, but inside, her heart was breaking a little more each day. The strange thing was, the more time she spent around David, the stronger that nagging feeling became. Sometimes, when he was concentrating on his phone or reading the newspaper, she'd catch a glimpse of something in his expression that made her chest tighten with an old, familiar pain. The way he pressed his lips together when he was thinking. The way he rubbed his forehead when he was tired. These little gestures stirred memories she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they weren't real. On this particular Tuesday morning, Dorothy was in David's study, carefully dusting around his desk. She'd learned to be extra cautious in this room because he seemed to notice every tiny detail. As she cleaned around a stack of business magazines, her cloth caught on something, and a small picture frame fell face up on the desk. It was a photo of a young David, maybe in his 20s, standing in front of his first office building with a huge smile on his face. But what made Dorothy's heart stop was what she saw in that smile. It was the same bright, hopeful grin she remembered from 45 years ago, when she'd held a tiny baby in her arms and memorized every detail of his perfect little face before. The adoption workers came to take him away. Her hands trembled as she reached for the frame, and for just a moment she let herself really look at the photo. The shape of his eyes, the way his eyebrows curved, even the dimple in his left cheek. They were all exactly the same as the baby she'd named Thomas before the adoptive family changed his name to David. "What do you think you're doing?" Dorothy spun around to find David standing in the doorway, his face dark with anger. She'd been so lost in the photograph that she hadn't heard him come home early from his meeting. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wellington," she stammered, quickly setting the frame down. "I was just dusting and it fell over. I was putting it back." David strode across the room, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "You were snooping through my personal things. That's what you were doing." "No, sir, I would never—" "Don't lie to me." David's voice was getting louder now, and Dorothy could see a vein pulsing in his temple. "I saw you staring at that photo like you had some right to pry into my private life. Do you think because you work in my house you can go through my personal belongings?" Dorothy felt her own temper starting to rise, something that rarely happened after decades of swallowing her pride for the sake of keeping jobs. "Mr. Wellington, I was only cleaning. The frame fell, and I was putting it back where it belonged." "Where it belonged," David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You people always think you know where things belong, don't you? Always think you can take liberties just because you're allowed in someone's home." The words hit Dorothy like a physical blow. You people. In those two words, she heard 40 years of discrimination, of being treated as less than human, of working twice, as hard for half the respect. But worse than the insult was the realization of who was saying it. Standing there, watching David's face twist with anger and contempt, the resemblance became undeniable. This wasn't just her imagination or wishful thinking. The man in front of her, this successful businessman who treated her like dirt beneath his shoes, was the baby boy she'd held in her arms 4 decades ago, the child she'd given up because she wanted him to have a better life than she could provide. "You know what?" David continued, his voice cold and final. "I'm tired of your excuses. I'm tired of your mistakes. And I'm especially tired of you thinking you can snoop around my house like you own the place." Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, not from his cruelty, but from the heartbreak of seeing what her son had become. All those years, she'd wondered about him. She'd imagined him growing up happy and loved, becoming a good man who treated people with kindness. Never in her worst nightmares had she pictured this moment. "Pack your things," David said, turning away from her as if she was already gone. "I want you out of my house in 1 hour." "Mr. Wellington, please." Dorothy's voice broke. "I need this job. My sister is sick and—" "I don't care about your sister." David snapped, whirling back around. "I don't care about your problems. All I care about is having competent help, and you're obviously not capable of doing the job properly." Dorothy stood there, looking at this man who had once been the most precious thing in her world, and felt her heart shatter completely. "I understand, sir," she said quietly. "Good. And don't expect a reference. I won't lie and say you were satisfactory when you clearly weren't." As David walked toward the door, Dorothy found her voice one more time. "Mr. Wellington?" He paused, but didn't turn around. "I hope someday you find whatever it is you're really angry about," she said softly. "Because it isn't me, and it isn't the coffee or the towels or anything else in this house." David's shoulders tensed, but he didn't respond. He simply walked out, leaving Dorothy alone in the study with the photograph that had started it all. For a long moment, Dorothy just stood there, staring at the picture of the young man who'd been so proud of his first business success. Somewhere, inside that angry, bitter person was still the baby she'd loved more than life itself. The baby she'd given up so he could have opportunities she couldn't give him. With shaking hands, she set the frame back exactly where it had been, face down, the way David kept it. Then she walked slowly toward the door, her feet heavy with the weight of a grief she'd carried for 45 years. As she packed her few belongings in the basement room, Dorothy pulled out a worn manila envelope she'd kept in her purse for decades. Inside were the adoption papers, a hospital bracelet, and one tiny photograph of a newborn baby with bright, curious eyes. She'd carried these papers to every job, every apartment, every new chapter of her life, holding on to the hope that someday she might see her son again. Now she had seen him, and he had thrown her out of his house without knowing who she was. Dorothy whispered a prayer for the angry, lonely man upstairs who had everything money could buy, but seemed to have nothing that really mattered. Then she picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door, leaving behind the son she'd never stopped loving, even when he couldn't love her back. Dorothy sat on the narrow bed in her sister's small apartment, staring at the manila envelope that had lived in her purse for 45 years. Her hands shook as she opened it for the 100th time, pulling out papers that had grown soft and yellow with age. The adoption certificate, a hospital bracelet so tiny it could barely fit around her thumb, and one precious photograph of a baby with bright, alert eyes. "Baby boy Johnson," she whispered, reading the name on the birth certificate. "Born December 15th, 1978, 3:47 a.m. Weight, 6 pounds, 4 ounces. She remembered that night like it was yesterday. She'd been just 22 years old, working 2 jobs to pay for a tiny studio apartment, with no family to help her and no money. For childcare. The father had disappeared the moment she told him she was pregnant, leaving her completely alone. For 9 months, she'd talked to her belly, telling her unborn baby about all the dreams she had for him. "You're going to be somebody special," she used to whisper late at night when she couldn't sleep. "You're going to have all the chances I never had." But when the social worker explained how adoption worked, how a wealthy family was waiting to give her baby everything she couldn't provide, good schools, nice clothes, a safe neighborhood, 2 parents who could afford to take care of him properly, Dorothy knew she had to make the hardest choice of her life. She'd held him for 3 days in the hospital, memorizing every detail. The way his tiny fingers wrapped around hers. The little sounds he made when he slept. The way his eyes seemed to look right into her soul, as if he was trying to remember her face too. "I love you more than anything in this world," she'd whispered on the last morning, tears falling onto his soft blanket. "I'm giving you away because I love you. Please don't ever think I didn't want you." The adoptive parents had seemed kind. The Wellingtons. They'd already raised 2 children and wanted to give a home to one more. They promised Dorothy they would tell David about his adoption when he was old enough to understand, and that they would love him as if he was their own blood. Now, sitting in the dim light of her sister's bedroom, Dorothy wondered what had gone wrong. The successful businessman she'd worked for bore no resemblance to the happy, loved child she'd imagined. Instead, David Wellington was angry, bitter, and cruel, especially to people he saw as beneath him. Rose shuffled into the room, moving slowly because of the diabetes that was stealing her strength a little more each day. "You've been staring at those papers for 2 hours," she said gently, sitting down beside her sister. "What happened at that job today?" Dorothy had told Rose she'd been fired, but not the real reason why. How could she explain that she'd found her son after 45 years, only to discover he'd grown up to be the kind of person who would treat her like garbage? "Rose," Dorothy said slowly, "what would you do if you found something you'd been looking for your whole life, but it wasn't what you hoped it would be?" Rose studied her sister's face. They'd lived together for the past 5 years since Rose's husband died, and she knew Dorothy better than anyone. "This is about more than losing a job, isn't it?" Dorothy nodded, fresh tears starting to fall. "Remember the baby I told you about? The one I gave up when I was young?" "Of course." "You never stopped wondering about him?" "I found him, Rose. After all these years, I found him." Dorothy's voice broke. "And he's not who I thought he'd be." Rose took her sister's hand. "Tell me what happened." So Dorothy told her everything, about working for David Wellington, about the strange feeling of recognition, about the photograph that confirmed her suspicions, and about the terrible scene in his study when he fired her with such cruel words. "He called me you people, Rose. He looked at me like I was nothing. Like I was just some woman trying to take advantage of him." Dorothy wiped her eyes with a tissue. "All these years I told myself I did the right thing. I gave him up so he could have a better life, become a better person than I could help him be." Rose was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd heard. Finally, she spoke. "Dorothy, you did do the right thing. What he became isn't your fault. But what if I'd kept him? What if I'd found a way to raise him myself? What if..." Rose shook her head. "You were 22 years old with no money and no help. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. You can't blame yourself for how he turned out." Meanwhile, across town in his enormous mansion, David was having the worst night of his life. After Dorothy left, he'd tried to go back to work, to focus on his business deals and forget about the whole unpleasant scene. But something kept nagging at him, like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He found himself back in his study, staring at the overturned photograph on his desk. He'd kept it face down for months because looking at it reminded him of things he preferred not to think about: his adoption, his birth parents. The questions he'd never gotten answers to because the Wellingtons had died in a car accident when he was 25, taking their secrets with them. David picked up the frame and looked at his younger self. So hopeful, so proud of his first real achievement. He'd been different then, before years of business battles and betrayals had hardened his heart. Before he'd learned that the only person he could truly depend on was himself. A few weeks ago, driven by curiosity he couldn't explain, David had requested his adoption records from the state. The file had arrived just yesterday, but he hadn't opened it yet. Something about seeing his past in official documents felt too final, too real. Now, sitting alone in his perfect house that felt more like a museum than a home, David walked to his safe and pulled out the sealed envelope. His hands trembled as he opened it, and official papers spilled onto his desk. The first document made his blood run cold. Original birth certificate, baby boy Johnson. Mother, Dorothy Mae Johnson. Father, unknown. Date of birth, December 15th, 1978, Dorothy Johnson. The same name as his housekeeper, the woman he'd just fired with such cruelty. David's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his leather chair, staring at the papers in disbelief. It couldn't be a coincidence. Johnson was a common name, but Dorothy Mae Johnson, and the birth date matched perfectly with his adoption records. With shaking hands, he flipped through more documents: hospital records, social worker notes, and then a piece of paper that made his heart stop completely. Birth mother's statement: "I love this baby more than my own life. I'm placing him for adoption because I want him to have opportunities I cannot provide. I pray every day that his new family will love him and help him become a good man. Please tell him someday that his first mother never stopped thinking about him." David read those words over and over, his vision blurring with tears he hadn't shed in decades. The woman who'd cleaned his house, who'd endured his criticism and cruelty with quiet dignity, who'd tried so hard to please him despite his impossible standards. She was his mother. His birth mother, who'd given him up out of love, not because she didn't want him, and he had treated her like she was nothing. He'd called her "you people" and thrown her out of his house. He'd been cruel to the one person in the world who'd loved him before he even took his first breath. David buried his face in his hands and wept like he hadn't since he was a child. All his success, all his money, all his pride, none of it mattered now. He'd found his mother and lost her in the same moment, destroyed any chance of a relationship with his own selfishness and anger. The worst part was realizing that Dorothy had recognized him. She must have known who he was, and still she'd endured his treatment. Still she'd tried to do her job well. Still she'd looked at him with kindness, even when he showed her none in return. As the clock struck midnight in his empty mansion, David made a decision. He had to find her. He had to try to make things right, even if it was too late, even if she could never forgive him for the man he'd become. Because for the first time in his adult life, David Wellington understood what it meant to lose something that truly mattered. David didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, staring at the adoption papers and thinking about all the moments he'd missed with Dorothy. Every harsh word he'd spoken to her played back in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. By the time the sun rose, he knew what he had to do, but finding Dorothy proved harder than he expected. She'd never given him her address, and the employment agency said they couldn't share personal information about their workers. David drove through the city for hours, checking bus stops and small diners, hoping to spot her familiar figure. He felt lost in a way that had nothing to do with directions. Finally, he remembered Dorothy mentioning her sick sister during their last conversation. He started calling hospitals and clinics, asking if they had a patient named Rose Johnson. On his 15th call, a nurse at the county medical center said yes. Rose was scheduled for an appointment that afternoon. David arrived at the clinic early and waited in the parking lot, his expensive car looking out of place among the older vehicles. When he saw Dorothy helping an older woman out of a taxi, his heart nearly stopped. Even from a distance, he could see the family resemblance. They had the same gentle way of moving, the same caring attention to each other. He watched Dorothy guide her sister up the steps to the clinic entrance, supporting her weight when Rose stumbled slightly. The tenderness in Dorothy's actions reminded David of how she'd tried to take care of him too, despite his constant criticism. 2 hours later, Dorothy and Rose emerged from the building. Rose looked tired, but was walking a bit better. David took a deep breath and approached them slowly, his hands shaking. "Dorothy," he called out softly. Both women turned, and Dorothy's face went pale when she saw him. She stepped protectively in front of her sister, as if David might somehow hurt her. "Mr. Wellington," Dorothy said, her voice careful and distant. "What are you doing here?" David stopped a few feet away, suddenly unsure of his words. "How do you apologize for a lifetime of anger? How do you explain that you've discovered your whole world has changed?" "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "Please. It's important." Rose looked between them, sensing something bigger than a simple employer-employee conversation. "Dorothy, who is this man?" Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice steady. "This is David Wellington, Rose, the man I worked for, the man who fired me." "And more than that," David said, his voice breaking slightly. "So much more than that." Dorothy stared at him, and for a moment, David thought she might walk away. Then she saw something in his face, the same vulnerability she'd glimpsed in that photograph from his younger days. "Rose, this is—" Dorothy's voice faltered. She took a shaky breath. "Rose, this is my son." Rose's eyes went wide with shock. She looked at David with new understanding, seeing the resemblance she'd missed before. "Your son? The baby you gave up?" David nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he found his voice, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I found the adoption papers last night. I know who you are now. I know what I did." The three of them stood in the clinic parking lot, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of traffic and people going about their daily lives, while their world shifted completely. "Maybe we should sit down somewhere," Rose suggested gently, recognizing that this conversation needed privacy. They found a small park across the street with benches under tall oak trees. David sat across from Dorothy and Rose, studying his birth mother's face in the afternoon sunlight. She looked older than her 67 years, worn down by decades of hard work and worry. "How long have you known?" David asked. "Since the second day I worked for you," Dorothy admitted. "You have the same expressions you had as a baby, the way you concentrate when you're thinking, the way you rub your forehead when you're tired. I carried your picture with me for 45 years. I knew your face." David felt like someone had punched him in the chest. "And I treated you so badly. All those weeks you knew who I was. And I was horrible to you." "You didn't know," Dorothy said softly, but her voice carried deep pain. "You couldn't have known." "But you did, and you stayed anyway. You tried to do your job well, even when I made it impossible." David's voice cracked. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, watching a squirrel gather acorns in the grass. "What was I supposed to say? Hello? I'm the woman who gave you away when you were 3 days old? You were angry enough without that." "I wasn't angry at you," David said desperately. "I mean, I was, but not really. I was angry at everything, at growing up without knowing where I came from, at feeling like nobody wanted me, at having to fight for everything I ever got." Rose spoke up quietly. "Your sister never stopped wanting you. She just wanted better for you than she could give." David looked at Dorothy, really looked at her, and saw the woman who'd given him life written in every line of her face. "Why did you keep working for me when I was so cruel?" "Because you were my son," Dorothy said simply, as if it explained everything. "And because I could see you were hurting, even if I didn't understand why. The Wellingtons, my adoptive parents. They died when I was 25, David explained. They never told me much about my adoption. I grew up knowing I was adopted but not knowing anything about you. I used to imagine you were someone who just didn't want a baby." Dorothy's face crumpled. "Oh, David, I wanted you more than anything in the world. Giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did. But I was 22 with no money, no family, no way to give you the life I thought you deserved. You gave me life," David said, his own tears starting to fall. "That was enough. That was everything." They sat in silence for a while, processing 4 decades of misunderstanding and missed connections. Finally, David spoke again. "I don't know how to be a son," he admitted. "I've been alone for so long, I don't know how to be family to anyone." "We don't have to figure it all out today," Dorothy said gently. "Maybe we could just start by getting to know each other. The real you, not the angry man from the mansion, and the real me, not just your housekeeper." David nodded, wiping his eyes. "I'd like that, more than anything." And I'd like you to meet Rose properly. She helped raise me after our parents died. She's been wanting to meet you for 45 years. Rose smiled, extending her hand to David. I'm your Aunt Rose. I've heard about you every day since you were born. David shook her hand, then surprised them both by leaning over and hugging her gently. Thank you for taking care of her. Thank you for taking care of my mother. Over the next several hours, they shared stories. Dorothy told David about his birth father, a young man who got scared and ran away. She told him about the pregnancy, about how she'd worked 2 jobs right up until labor started. She showed him the hospital bracelet and the adoption papers she'd carried all these years. David told them about his childhood with the Wellingtons, about his struggles in business, about the loneliness that had driven him to build walls around his heart. He apologized again and again for his treatment of Dorothy, and each time she forgave him with the patience only a mother could have. As the sun began to set, David made a decision that surprised even him. Move in with me, he said suddenly. Both of you, not as employees, as family. That big house is just sitting there empty. It should have people in it who actually care about each other. Dorothy looked shocked. David, we couldn't. We don't fit in a place like that. Then help me make it a place where we all fit, David said. Help me turn it into a real home instead of just an expensive showpiece. 6 months later, the Wellington mansion was a completely different place. Dorothy's vegetable garden grew in the backyard where pristine landscaping used to be. Rose's medical equipment was set up in a sunny room on the first floor so she wouldn't have to climb stairs. And David had learned to make coffee just the way Dorothy liked it, not too strong with just a touch of cream. The house that had once felt like a cold museum now rang with laughter and conversation. David discovered he had his mother's gift for storytelling and his aunt's sense of humor. Dorothy learned that her son was brilliant and generous when he wasn't trying to protect himself from the world. Most importantly, David finally understood what real wealth looked like. It wasn't in his bank account or his business deals. It was in having Sunday dinner with his mother and aunt, listening to Dorothy hum old songs while she cooked, and knowing that no matter what happened, he was loved exactly as he was. The lonely boy who'd grown up thinking nobody wanted him had finally found his way home.